So, Doug and Dave have created a treatise for regular temperament theory. And it's, I think, stuff that has existed before, but there's a little bit of terminology that improves upon some of the old stuff. I don't know if you guys would care to get into that, but there were some places where I went to charts of units and saw that like you're calling vals mappings and things like that. Is there a good way to summarize sort of anything you would consider a change?
Sure,
Well,
you go.
sorry, Dave.
Douglas, you go.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a way to summarize it. There's some, you know, um, what was the term you used, Dave? Catch cries, call cries? Uh, like
Yeah.
principles, design principles that we used for deciding on when to iterate upon existing terminology and when to, because there's costs to changing terminology and when to just, use what is already out there, what already works. A lot of what we've done is not really original work. It's more, as you've said, like centralizing information that was out there in like a million Paul Ehrlich comments on Facebook and thousands of message threads on the Yahoo tuning list archives and from, the olden days, by which I mean like 20 years ago. But the original stuff that we did, well, there was some original research that we did here and there, like our target interval sets, the truncated integer limit triangle. That's a bit of original work that we did when we weren't satisfied with simply the odd limit diamonds as constant sets to tune with respect to.
Yeah, let me butt in there. So yeah, most of the original work is the pedagogy. So we basically took the last 20 years worth of work in regular temperament theory and pushed and prodded it and came up with consistent terminology, because different people working on it over the years have used different terminology, and it's hard to keep it straight. And some of that terminology is pretty idiosyncratic. It doesn't give you any clue to what the thing is. It's just a random word, and that's a real barrier to new people entering the field. So we tried to use descriptive terminology whenever we could. And so one of the catch cries Douglas mentioned was to encode, don't encrypt. In other words, when we're condensing a complex, not complex, a long description, something might be a long description of this mathematical object, and we want to condense it down to a single word, we try and do it in a way that encodes that meaning and doesn't hide it.
Yeah, like for example, what does val mean? Like, what a val is. You maybe know what a val is, but what does val mean?
Yeah, I just know it because I always see the three little numbers. And then I pray that it's just a unit that makes sense and is somehow a comma or something. And probably I'll only recognize it if it's mean tone temperament, things like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of sad that, well, we don't miss val so much. We replace that with the term map, so that the map is just one row of a mapping, where the mapping is the matrix and the map is a single row. But we do kind of miss Monzo because we love Joe. But we still felt we had to rename that and just call it a vector, just the simple mathematical object that it is.
Yeah, there are some people that do really like all the names, Monzo, Weil, Keys, Benedetti, Tenney, etc. finding them, memorable and cute or interesting. But that's the perfect example of encrypting meaning. Unless you're familiar with the historical ideas that can be traced to these people and then associate them with what they're being invoked to represent, it's not helpful. And most people don't. So.
Right, unfortunately. I guess you guys might be familiar with other examples of terms that were named after historical figures that maybe are in mathematics that are a bit confusing in the same way. I know I'm not familiar with any of those off the top of my head, but like just terms like Gaussian and things like that.
Yeah, well, we even tried to avoid those, but the one we couldn't avoid was Euclidean.
Yeah.
Figure if we're going that far back in time, Euclid published the single most successful textbook in the history of humanity. It's been going for thousands of years. We can consider him to have transcended eponymity, as we say.
Right.
How did you two decide that you should create this document, and what's sort of the origin story for deciding to make it? Because it looks like it's just taken a monumental amount of effort. Lots of times when you go to the Xen Harmonic wiki and there's a page about a tuning system, if not very much information has been put up there, it often looks like lists of numbers, and then you have to figure out what the lists of numbers mean through context, like whether they'll be sense or just tuning or something relating to that. But you guys have intricate graphs based on fundamental concepts that have been established for a very long time. So yeah, I'm really curious about the entire process, going back and forth and sort of the origin story.
Sure. I mean, I can speak to that. Well, I mean, Dave's involved in the story from a way earlier point in time, but the project probably wouldn't have happened without my obsession. And there wasn't really so much of a decision to make this thing. I think Dave would agree that it sort of, just emerged gradually as we just got deeper and deeper sunk into this quicksand of how ambitious it turned out to be. We did not plan that we'd spend almost 2 years on this.
So my short version is I enlisted Douglas to help me with Sagittal, particularly after the passing of George Secor. And I made the mistake of going away for 2 weeks bushwalking in Tasmania, and Douglas got interested in learning regular temperament theory. So when I came back, I found I had to help him get over that obsession before I could get him back to Sagittal, and that has taken 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, for a little extra detail, I became friends with Dave when I decided that for the pieces that I had composed, and I typically did computer, electronic music, and never had to worry about notation for all this microtonal stuff I was doing. But then I made up my mind, no, I'm going to have a live acoustic performance of a bunch of pieces I've composed. This is before COVID.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, well, I got to figure out how to notate this stuff, and then explored all the various offerings out there. And when I came across Sagittal, I felt like a deep appreciation for and almost mysteriously instantaneous kinship with the creators of the system. It just seemed like the kind of thing that I wish I would have designed myself. And I just kind of got involved with Dave in finishing various assets that hadn't been finished yet, or iterating on them, I guess. And then when he went away for that trip to Tasmania, I was on one of the message threads on the Sagittal forum talking with Herman Miller, another one of the co-founders of the modern RTT paradigm, that was about sagittal notation for regular temperaments. And I was just trying to figure out what the heck these guys were talking about. Like at that point, I sort of knew, well, I knew about commas, and I knew a bit about equal temperament maps, just like single rows of numbers. I think I'd known about those for a long time. Jacob Barton and Andrew Heathwaite taught me that stuff at my first Zen Harmonic Praxis summer camp back in 2011. But I never really got much farther than that. So this regular temperament stuff was so vague and mysterious and confusing to me. But I wanted to be able to notate it with sagittal, and just one thing led to another, and I was so frustrated with how difficult it was for me to learn it that I didn't want anybody else to have to struggle that hard again. And
yeah,
it turned out it took 2 years to make the document that I wish I would have had.
Yeah, and it wasn't, my cute story before wasn't entirely true. I'd had the feeling for, decades that we could do a good job on teaching regular temperament theory if we just narrowed it down to the prerequisite, basically only being linear algebra, which is what's taught sometimes in late high school, but usually in first year university courses. Whereas all the other mathematics that was used in regular temperament theory was more advanced. And I didn't think we needed it, but I'd never been able to prove that. And, I saw with Douglas' interest an opportunity not to be missed, because the best teacher is somebody who's just learned something. Well, I mean, as long as they have some basic teaching skills, and Douglas has way more than that. He's worked as a language teacher. So I couldn't.
Well, Dave, you've been a teacher too, so.
Yeah, well, that's true. I've been a teacher of electricians, teaching them to install solar power systems.
How did you figure out what kinds of units you needed for various multiplications? It seems like that would have been kind of difficult to reverse engineer. Are those sorts of things actually mentioned anywhere, like cents per prime and things like that? Or,
as far as I'm aware, the units analysis of RTT is kind of a new take. I'm not going to say that we're the first people to ever suggest that, but certainly it hasn't been done to this extent before. I remember. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, it's basically an engineer and physicist view on it. In other words, mine. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember when you sent me that email for the first time, Dave, when you said that a mapping, like, I was just like, what are the numbers, the individual numbers in a mapping? Because we were talking about how do you slice it by columns, how do you slice it by rows? And you told me each of the numbers in a mapping is generators per prime. And that just completely blew my mind. And to you, it was no big deal, but it blew my mind so much that I basically insisted that we had to develop that further. And I really hope that it helps other people in the same way.
Yeah, I'd just sort of taken it for granted. But when I saw the effect it had when I used it to explain this stuff to Douglas, I thought, yep, we have to work this out in detail and nail it down. Yeah, it took quite a while. I mean, we were still thrashing out the details of it in the last 6 months of last year. But yeah, it was just emails back and forth, many emails.
Yeah, I think it's revolutionary, because it's revolutionary because you actually get to see what the numbers mean and how they interact. I think a lot of these examples are really great, and I think maybe a lot of people would want to see how you get notes from almost every single example. I mean, I know you guys put that in a lot, but I mean, like, there's certain levels of abstraction that you can use to create, to figure out what a temperament is and then create a tuning from that. I also like how you guys very carefully define tuning and temperament, because I've personally seen those words thrown around, and I've thrown them around myself because they haven't been well defined in this sort of documented way.
Right. Yeah, it'd be great if we wish there were more audio examples, or we wish there were some audio examples, but doing the words and the visuals and trying to tie it back to music as often as possible, using words at least, that's kind of the best we can do. This was like hard enough.
Oh yeah,
it'd be great if someone else could come along and do the audio examples. Yeah,
because I feel like the audio examples, those are really helpful in situations where the thing that you do results in some kind of tuning, and then you can demonstrate that tuning. But then if what you're talking about has to do with relationships between tunings, such as in the projective tuning space section, then it doesn't really make sense to provide a musical example if you're just talking about like, oh, well, this is where 40 tone equal temperament is in the graph, and it's actually doubles of 10 and 20 and all of that stuff. So
yeah.
I can say I very much do not understand all of it. There's quite a few graphs that I did not understand, but I'll definitely be digging in more and rereading it and trying to look over it some more.
Well, if we ever publish the book version, I think we'll have to have your response in the Facebook thread on the back cover.
Oh,
it was very enthusiastic. Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
And I love that you really appreciated the units. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much. I feel like you, these are sort of like, these kinds of explanations are the tools from which other things can be built. Like, because we always want more examples of these things, right? But then you just have to go get an explanation from someone who knows how to do it. At least that's been kind of the rhythm of this thing for such a long time. But now I feel like if I just really sat down and looked at the mappings article and tried some out myself, like using Graham's regular temperament finder, for example, a really excellent tool. If I just sat down and did that myself, I would get some numbers that I might not know exactly what they were, but it's like, okay, if I do X and then Y and then Z, I will get this and it means this, instead of being like, oh, here's some numbers. They might mean sense primes and what have you, so it's a really nice left turn, I think, away from that sort of thing.
Yeah. Sense, primes, and generators. That's what it's all about. Yep. Everything is just putting those three things together in different ways.
Would you say it's fair to, like, the way I felt about it is, as long as I understand the concept of generators and periods, then basically I can kind of make sense of anything, even if I don't know the exact abstract tuning processes. Would it be fair to say that that's really the fundamental concept of this entire thing, is having some kind of period, and then various kinds of generators inside the scale?
Yeah, we even didn't use the word period very much. We just treated it like another generator.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we felt that it was easier to approach it that way to begin with, so that even when you're just looking at EDOs, then the step of the EDO is the generator.
The period is like a concept in a scale, and what most of what our guide deals with hasn't even reached the point of creating a scale from a temperament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the period is just that generator that happens to subdivide your interval of equivalence. Usually a generator that subdivides the octave is often called the period. But yeah, we didn't dwell much on that. I think we mentioned it in passing.
Yeah, there's a section where we talk about it, but I think part of the secret of what I think our project was a success was just how much we talked about this stuff. like just the sheer volume of text in the emails back and forth about this stuff, just forcing us to trial by fire all of our different concepts and frameworks and terminology. So I get the feeling that like a lot of the stuff on the Yahoo tuning groups is like a lot of people not in a vacuum, but not really like closely listening to each other and trying to make each other's terminology and conceptualizations work, but just like everyone throwing stuff out there and just seeing what sticks. Whereas Dave and I just, exchanged millions of words. Well, maybe not millions. What we approximated was like definitely over 1 million words worth of emails about this stuff.
Yes, for every term that we kept, there's probably 10 that we threw away.
Yeah, a lot of this was pretty iterative, and it's really funny to go back for me anyway, possibly for Dave, to go back to the earlier emails between us about this stuff and just see how far away we were from our final full understanding of some of these interrelations of concepts. Like for me, I think I started from the deep end and sort of had to like, well, I'm mixing metaphors here, but like dig myself out. When you're starting with the Xen wiki, in particular in the state it was before this guide existed, and you just try to learn about temperaments by poking around on the like lists of temperaments and what pieces of information are provided for each one. That set me up anyway for failure, in that I'm trying to understand what the heck is pot tuning.
Right.
And in Dave and I's article series, we don't explain that until like the second to last article.
Right.
Like that's one of the most advanced things, and I was starting with that.
That's another thing that the Xen Harmonic Wiki does that can be really, really frustrating is pairing simple concepts and advanced concepts together like they're kind of the same thing.
Yeah. I guess I had always associated the wiki with encyclopedic style information, because like the most popular wiki is Wikipedia, which is a pedia, an encyclopedia. But like in general, wikis are just guides, and our wiki contains a lot of encyclopedically formatted information, but also there's a lot of guide type articles up there already, and so we just felt that the guide style would be really helpful for this particular topic.
Yeah, and I just love Douglas's conversational style, the way he introduced topics, and whereas most of the wiki was written by mathematicians, and they're using rigorous terminology, but that doesn't help the beginner.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that Dave and I sync up on is informality. Like there's nothing to be gained by stiltedness, or that's just like another barrier to entry. We try to be as flippant isn't quite the right word, but friendly and fun, or that's what we're going for.
Yeah,
but at the same time, behind it all, I mean, that it's all summed up in that big table in the appendix with all the terms and their units and so on. Really, you could summarize our efforts as nailing down that big list and just agreeing on all those terms that worked consistently with each other. So, behind the conversational style, there's a strict system of terminology.
The projective tuning space article, I feel like highlights so many of the cool findings that you can have about that graph that many people have just heard like from Paul Erlich in the past.
Right.
Like when I first encountered projective tuning space, I knew that it was just so much information distilled into a space. that
Yes.
there was
that
so
was
much information about tuning, and it does something with the generator concept, and you can see where certain generators line up with other tunings. And then Paul was able to tell me much more information. It's so cool to just see all of that written down on its own page.
Yes.
One thing that I was not aware of, that I was reading about, was about the weightiness of intervals. I really like how you guys laid that down and talked about simple weighting versus complex weighting. Like if complex intervals get weighted more, like there's different reasons you can want to tune complex intervals accurately versus tuning simple intervals accurately.
Right. Yep.
Do you guys personally have any preference with how you use tunings? Like, is there, do either of you prefer to weight intervals simply or in a complex manner in your own personal use, or do you sort of take a more neutral approach, the unity weighting?
Yeah, my personal preference is to go right down the middle and use unweighted. Yeah. And that was also George Secor's preference.
Yeah, I share that as well. It's just simpler. Not to be confused with simplicity weighting, but
yeah, so it's both a compromise between the two extremes, and it's simpler. Yes.
Yeah, that does make sense. I'm inclined to think of myself as someone who would want to weight things complexly, just because of how precise those complex things have to be to prevent hearing them as something else. An 11/8 has to be tuned really well to prevent yourself from hearing it as a 7/5, things like that. But the other thing that strikes me about complex identities is that you can shift them very slightly and they can sound like chromatic reinterpretations of other things. And so I don't think it matters as much as I had previously thought in the past. But yeah.
Yeah.
So that's Harry Parcher's view, that the more complex intervals need to be tuned more accurately. And that has tended to be ignored. So, Stephen, if you want to try out some temperaments based on complexity weighting of intervals rather than either unweighted or simplicity weighted, you'd be probably trailblazing.
Wow, really? That's shocking to hear, actually. Just because of how important those complex intervals are. And you'd think like people have heard all the simple ones already, so it's time for the complex ones. I don't know. Yeah. That's totally backwards of how I would have thought that things were.
Yeah, well it's sorry, go on, Douglas.
I was gonna say that, I mean, that was Parch's view that, you'd have a limit, beyond which, 13 limit, 17 limit intervals we just ignore or put out of mind. But then as you approach that limit, it becomes more and more important to nail the ones that you do keep around. Exactly. But Parch didn't really do temperaments.
Right.
And so that's where you'd be trailblazing, is combining them. And the reason why simplicity weighting has gotten most of the attention with people who do temper is because it's a requirement of a particular type of tuning that has apparently attained overwhelming popularity, which are the all interval tuning schemes.
Can you explain to me what an all interval tuning scheme is? Is an all interval tuning scheme something like TOP tuning or TOPE tuning or TE tuning that deals with all intervals? And how is it dealing with all intervals?
Short answer, yes. TOP, TE, those are quintessential all interval tuning schemes.
By the way, I think our Zoom account is about to run out. It's telling me that I have less than a minute. So I'm going to save this and start another one, and then we can talk about that. Apologies.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
In order to understand what an all interval tuning scheme is and how it works, you first have to understand that the ordinary way or the simpler way to tune is to pick a certain set of intervals that you care about and tune with respect to those. A classic example being an odd limit diamond, such as Dave and I's tilt, as we call it, the truncated integer limit triangle.
So we call those target list tunings as opposed to all interval tunings.
Yeah, there was a page about those on the wiki, but it was remarkably short. Very little on the wiki said about these types of tunings.
And it was Paul Ehrlich's revolutionary paper, Middle Path, that introduced the first all-interval tuning. So that was a breakthrough he had when he was apparently convalescing from some illness. And this came to him that you could do this by what we now call simplicity weighting the intervals, that you could have a tuning that, in a sense, minimized the maximum damage over all intervals. But you had to have a very specific idea of what was meant by damage.
Yeah. Yeah, we probably shouldn't get into too much of mathematical detail on how it works. Like, it's in the advanced section of our series. No, it's the end of the intermediate section. Sorry.
That's the part where you guys talk about. That's the part where you guys talk about damage. Yeah, I read that part. It was very helpful because you had that little example where you were like, okay, here's how some intervals could be tuned, and then you talked about what terminology goes with that and how people refer to damage, which like totally cleared up the whole damage thing for me because I'd heard people say damage like all the time. How does badness fit into that? Is that something that you guys renamed, or how does that work?
Well, we didn't really do too much with badness. Badness is something that you care about when you're comparing temperaments to each other. And
yeah, outside of the scope of the articles.
Yeah, I mean, it's something if we one day really developed this into a full RTT textbook, we'd probably want a chapter on that, but wasn't our top priority.
Yeah, and we like the term badness, or at least I do.
Yeah.
Putting it simply, temperaments can be compared on how much error they have, or in other words, how much damage they produce to the intervals, and on how complex they are, which might be, how many generators do you have to iterate to get the intervals that you want, or how many different step sizes are there, that sort of complexity thing. So you've got damage and you've got complexity, and if you just multiply those two together, that gives you badness. So that gives you a single figure of merit to compare temperaments. So if you're generating if you've got a computer program generating millions of potential temperaments, this is what Gene Smith did years ago. He wrote software that would generate millions of temperaments. Well, I don't know millions, but lots of temperaments, and compare them, sort them on badness. So, he needed a single figure of merit to sort them, and then we could peel them off the top and look at them individually.
Yeah. And actually, I haven't even told Dave this, but the other morning, I just started poking around the code behind Graham Breed's temperament finder, because it just bothered me that I didn't feel like I really understood how it searched for temperaments. And I can sum it up pretty quickly. It first just like gathers a few building block equal temperaments that can be used, like if it's searching for a bunch of rank 2 temperaments that within a certain prime limit and with a certain balance of error and complexity, it just gathers those building blocks and then just tries all the different combinations of them and filters out the ones that are too complex or have too much error. And that's how it works.
Yeah, the trade-off between damage and complexity, I think, is another temperament issue that can be explained in sort of a simple way, kind of like an age-old truth of tuning, I suppose. Like, you can use a lot more notes to get more accurate, but then that is hard because then you have more notes to deal with. This might be completely unrelated, but I've always wanted to know what units of badness would be. Like, what's an average badness for a temperament, and what would be like an insane amount of badness? Like, these are the kinds of things that I have no scope for that are very interesting mathematically, and that the units would illuminate.
Good one. Yeah, there are many different complexity measures for temperaments. So that's different from complexity of intervals. So we haven't examined complexity of temperaments in our work at all, but there are many different systems. And I don't know what their units are. So
exercise for the reader.
Yeah. So we know the units of damage are weighted cents. And in other words, cents with some brackets after them telling you what the weighting is, whether it's complexity, simplicity, or unweighted. But the complexity of temperaments, I don't know offhand what that would be. But if you multiply the two together, then you've got the units for badness.
Yeah. It seems like some tricky stuff, but also like it could be a really useful number. But yeah, with complexly weighting things, it occurs to me that register is also really important in tuning. Like, for example, if you take a 720 cent perfect fifth and you play it pretty low, it basically still sounds like a power chord. But the more complex higher harmonics kind of stick out more, and they sort of need to be in the higher register, I think, to be really heard as themselves, and that all is a psychoacoustic thing. I think I unfairly dismissed the 7 limit when at a younger age I learned that like 17/12 was just like 2 cents off of a 12-tone equal tempered note or something. And then I was like, oh wait, that's just gonna sound these things have become redundant was the way I thought of it. But I think it might be possible to make that really work. I've heard lots of good things about isoharmonic chords, but I haven't tried them out as much as I would have liked. Chords that have, that are in the harmonic series, but then they have the same amount of multiplication value away, like 13, 16, 19. You've got 3 in between each of those.
Yes.
Those seem like really fertile ground for those high harmonics. Exactly
right. Yeah. The only way to really make those high prime numbers have an audible specialness is to put them in big isoharmonic chords. Yeah.
And so the last couple things you're bringing up sort of speak to the limitations of RTT, which we're not shy about. We mentioned them in the article. It's one of many tools that you can use to make microtonal music. It doesn't really account for things like register, as you're saying. It gives you, as long as you're aware of the limitations of what RTT can tell you about the music you could try to write with it, you'll be fine. But don't imagine that it does more than that.
But actually, the complexity weighting of damage that you're interested in, Stephen, that does give you a slight. Well, it does tend to give you what you would want in relation to register, whereas simplicity weighting does the opposite. But yes, there are things that regular temperament theory just can't deal with. And one of the things about isoharmonic chords is that they don't even have to be segments of the harmonic series. They can be completely irrational numbers as long as the spacing between them is the same.
Right.
That is a really excellent point.
And then you'd be looking for like equal beating tunings, perhaps, if you wanted to tune with respect to those chords, more so than like a regular temperament type approximation of them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I definitely don't think that RTT not working in every register definitely isn't a deficiency of the theory. It's just like a natural consequence of the fact that we assume moderate parameters for most theories, and then if you simply go towards the extreme end for anything, it kind of breaks. Just like anything in undergraduate theory with like functional chords, where you assume that there's a mostly moderate tempo so that the chords can have some function. But, if each chord was an hour long, it wouldn't sound like dominant, subdominant anymore. It just would be something ambient. And if it was too fast to perceive, it would sound like something else. So, that's all it is moderation.
Hard to account for all of the assumptions that are being made.
For sure.
Yeah, so we're trying to model something that's really messy, not just human psychoacoustics, how our brains are wired and how our ears work, how evolution has managed to cobble things together. That's messy enough. We've also got human culture and all the history of music making, and people have been brought up to hear things a certain way.
Yeah. Another thing that seems really tricky about dealing with regular temperament theory is how you can technically use math to temper anything to anything else, since the whole game is about making certain numbers sound like each other as intervals. Yeah. So, horrible circumstances like tempering out 3/2, technically the math still has to work for that, even though no one would ever do it. Things like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to do one last thing with you guys, if that's okay. Can we try going through an example using the mapping page?
Sure.
Yeah. I think it would be cool to finally do this in an instructive way with a tuning system that is not mean tone. I see you guys have it done with mean tone, which is perfect because that's a great entry level one. But I want to see if we can do it with something else. I was thinking porcupine could be good. Do you guys have a suggestion for something that would work? Like something we could maybe write down and I could show here where a comma is tempered out by a particular tuning.
No, porcupine's great.
Okay, let's do porcupine. Okay, neat. So I'm going to head over to this page right here. And maybe the audience can follow along if they're at a computer. I'm not sure. Maybe they'll want to. Maybe they listen to it in their cars. I don't really know. Okay, so I'm going to go to that first mappings page, which is page 2. Okay, so we have vectors and covectors. And so I see here that we have a dot product. Now, am I correct in assuming that if you take a dot product of a mapping and I want to call this a Monzo, but it's not, the one where the arrow points to the right, prime covector?
A vector.
Okay. Am I correct in assuming that if I take the multiplication of a mapping and a covector, then if the comma is tempered out, I should get 0, right?
The arrow pointing to the right is the vector.
Okay, sweet. Yeah. So let's try a porcupine.
And just another quibble. Yeah. When you say mapping, that could refer to a multiple map matrix. Yeah. And a dot product is vector multiplication or vector with covectors. So that'd be each row of the mappings combination with the vector. If you're talking about mapping a vector with a mapping matrix, then that'd be, you'd call that matrix multiplication, or, it's a sequence of dot products.
I see. Yeah. I really want to see if this works. Because I'm sure it will. But let's get our mapping for 22. So I guess we'd have to figure out what 22's octave, perfect fifth, and major third are. I don't know if you guys know it off the top of your head. We can definitely figure it out.
Are you going to create a porcupine mapping as a join of 7 and 22? Is that what you're doing?
Well, what I'm trying to do is, I see this picture of the dot product here where we have 12, 19, and 28 for 12 tet.
Yeah.
And then there's another one for 16 over 15, for example, and there's a multiplication where it gets mapped to a certain kind of step.
Yeah.
I was thinking we could do that with 22 tet and then the porcupine comma, and then we should get 0, right? Is that right? Am I thinking right? Am I right?
Well, when you said porcupine, I thought you meant porcupine temperament, but you just want to take the porcupine comma and then see some equal temperament, temper it out. Sure.
Yes.
That's good, because I was getting worried that this wasn't going to work with audio.
I am hopelessly equal tempered, but that is okay. Let's see. Okay, so now I'd go to the Xen Harmonic wiki. and I would look up the way I would do this, since I don't know it off the top of my head, is just to figure out what the major third is and then add an octave. So I'm going to go to 22 tone equal temperament on the wiki, and I like to do that by typing in 22 and then the letters E, D, and O. So then that just takes me to the page. And now in order to find the mapping of the perfect fifth, I can see that it's mapped to 13 steps out of 22. So then 13 plus 22 would be 35. So here's the mapping of 2, and here is the mapping of 3. I have 22 and 35 written on the paper. So now I have to find its mapping of the major third.
Right, so bringing that back to our units, that's 22 generators per prime of prime 2 and 35 generators per prime 3, where in this case the generator is just the step.
Yes. And let's see, the 5 would be, you would add 2 octaves to the mapping of a major third, right, in order to get the mapping of 5 over 1?
Right.
Okay, so it looks like we have 7 here. So I guess 7 plus 44 is 51.
Yep.
And so now we have something that's not a 12-tone mapping. We have, I'm going to see where I point. Okay, so we have 22 generators for prime 2, 35 generators for prime 3, 51 generators for prime 5. This is the kind of stuff that Numberphile pretends like they want. Maybe they'll get it someday.
I really hope so.
Oh my God, yes.
And just to the fastest way, when I have one that I don't have completely memorized like this one, I just go to Graham Breed's temperament finder, and you do a search by ETs. I just have to plug in 22 for the number of equal divisions of the octave, and 5 for 5 limit, and it just spits out 22, 35, 51 for me.
That's actually brilliant. This is the kind of stuff that you can theoretically do, and it's kind of easy, but if you're not doing the problem yourself, you would never do it. Like, I never do these problems recreationally, but I theoretically know how to do them. Okay, so then the porcupine comma is classic 250 over 243, and I see on the Xen Harmonic wiki page that the Monzo, that would be 1, -5, and 3.
That sounds about right.
Is this right? Do I put a little bracket here on that one?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so now if I take the dot product, I should get 0, right?
You should. Yes.
Okay, so 22 times 1 equals 22. For those of us who are just listening to audio, what I'm doing is I'm drawing 22 tets mappings for primes on a piece of paper, and then drawing the porcupine comma slightly below in a dot product like fashion, and then multiplying them to prove that the porcupine comma is tempered out. Okay, and then 35 times -5. I'm going to need my calculator because I'm tired, and that's fine. Let's see. So I guess that would be -175. That's interesting. And then for that last one, I would need to have 51 times 3, and that is 153. So now the bottom row reads 22, -175, 153. And now, am I correct in thinking we need to add all those together?
Correct.
Yeah, or just add the 2 positive ones and see that they cancel out with the negative one.
Yeah, 22 plus 153 is 175. So we did it. If we add up all of these numbers, we get 0.
Yay.
Yeah, so those of you watching can see that it does work with things that are not mean tone. Very exciting. Well, that was cool. I really hope somebody looks at this and is like, oh man, okay, that does make sense now.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, the stuff I was saying a moment ago about matrix multiplication versus vector multiplication, aka that we're going to do a bunch of dot products. That was only relevant if you're going to show that the porcupine comma is tempered out by, the porcupine comma is tempered out by porcupine temperament.
Right.
Which
I see.
Its mapping would have 2 rows because it's a rank 2 mapping.
I see.
And if you wanted to continue, what we could do is we could show how 7 ET also tempers out the porcupine comma.
Oh, yeah.
I know we're short on time, so maybe I could just like really quickly point this out, that
Yes.
if you repeated that experiment with the mapping for 7 ET, which might be, was that like 7, 11, 16? I can't remember. That'd come out to 0. And now if you put those 2 rows, one right on top of each other, and you map the porcupine comma by them, you'd get a new vector that would be 0, 0. And that's what being tempered out looks like for a rank 2 temperament. The interval maps to 0 of each generator.
What? Oh my God. Okay, my mind's being
Too
blown
much
right now. I don't know if I can handle that. That's great
I think
though.
better
I love
edit
that.
off.
That's so cool. So like if we had more time, theoretically, what you're saying is we could stack 2 rows, but the 2 rows would be like some equal temperament that tempers that porcupine and a different equal temperament that tempers that porcupine. And those would come out to 0, and that would mean something else.
Yeah, and that, of course, because I know that you're interested in that projective tuning space diagram, that corresponds to the fact that it falls along the line. It's the line that goes through both 7 ET and 22 ET. Along that, anywhere along that line, the porcupine comma is tempered out.
Oh, that's so cool. What's also really fun are those tunings that are sort of famous for tempering out certain commas weirdly or mapping steps weirdly. Like, for example, 21 tone equal temperament mapping the syntonic comma negatively, right? Like, doesn't it map it to -1 step?
With 21?
Maybe? Yeah, or maybe I'm wrong about that.
It could be. I just don't happen to know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there are weird things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, or another example like the apotomy, or what's the other word for the apotomy? Like the Pythagorean chromatic semitone. Yeah, like a sharp 2187 over 2048. That maps a -1 step in 16 ET. So its sharpness is negative.
And then people try and do that native fifth notation where the qualities are backwards and it's completely unreadable. But
inadvisable, perhaps.
Indeed.
Anyway, but I encourage you to work through to the end of Article 2, and then you'll totally get. And if you don't totally get what I said about 7 and 22, vanishing the porcupine comma, and thus that their merger, porcupine temperament, is the temperament that tempers it to 0, 0, then we need to work on the article. But I know you can do it.
Well, that's the thing is, like, I'm 100% confident that, like, if all my attention was on the article and I, like, went over every point, I could deduce that. It's just that, like, I do feel as if regular temperament theory is so, like, there's so many different circumstances that can arise that anytime someone like brings up how to multiply numbers, it seems like a completely new situation. And I just have to stop and be like, okay, what are these numbers doing? Where do they go? What's happening? How does this relate? You know, it's like that kind of thing. So
yeah, I don't think you're just going to read through it and just get it all. You need some time to sit with it. People have suggested that we actually add exercises.
Maybe that would be so cool. Yeah. Do you guys have any, I know you guys are hinting at a textbook. Any big plans for that you can share publicly, or not yet, or?
No.
No.
Okay. It's just always been in the back of our mind. We just thought of it as a textbook. It's like, if we didn't have so much other stuff to catch up on, we could turn it into an ebook and a print-on-demand book.
Yeah,
but that would be a whole lot more work. Yeah,
it's actually rather ridiculous how
it may never happen.
How close I got to finishing a series of tutorial videos for sagittal notation.
Yes.
When it got derailed by this RTT project, so I really first I gotta get a job, but then I'm gonna get back to the sagittal stuff and tie that up, and I do hope that that'll be a positive influence on the community as well.
Yeah, very much so. If you are listening to the podcast and you haven't seen, Doug has a presentation on sagittal notation that he presented with at Parnu, an Estonian conference, on YouTube, and I can put the link in the description. It's a very thorough and informative, I would say, on a level that other sagittal documents had not been.
Sweet. Well, thanks for the encouragement. I think the tutorial series will be like that, but like 10x, like just blown up into more depth, more detail. So
yeah, that's very exciting. And then when this ball gets rolling and, people continue to add more examples that are pedagogically helpful, I think that's really gonna kickstart some stuff. It occurs to me that regular temperament theory has not been, to put this lightly, abused for potential absurdity. Because people are wanting to tune things correctly and all of that good stuff. I want to Douglas, I don't know if you heard the emoji album, but Paul and I found that temperament on purpose that breaks the temperament finder, and things like that. So I'd be really interested in exploiting certain tuning features to make really, really weird numerical things happen. I wonder if anyone has gone through and figured out a bunch of tunings that map well-known commas to really weird steps. Does 18 tone equal temperament map a perfectly normal garden variety comma to -5 steps? I mean,
right.
I'd like to use things like that because they just,
or stuff like go looking for temperaments with maximum badness instead of minimum.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Maximum badness are just weird values that are suggested by the theory, but in practice are heard completely differently.
I like it. Mathematics abuse. I'm all in favor of it.
Yeah. I mean, I'll always remember that when Jacob and Andrew taught me commas for the first time, they told me that they were like puns, like arithmetic puns, making two numbers that are close the same. But there's a lot of potential for jokes, like just flat out absurd musical jokes using RTT that I think you'd be the perfect person to tap into, Stephen. And I'd love to help you do it.
Yeah. Maybe that can kickstart Emoji Album 2, which might not be a thing, but it might be. I don't know. Sequels are never as good as the original, but what are you going to do?
You never know.
But yeah.
Could happen.
Well, yeah. Anyway, thanks. Thanks so much for coming on, guys. I think I am gonna have to get going now. But I really appreciate you writing this article and for taking the time to meet with me about it on the podcast.
Thank you for talking to us, and thank you for your enthusiastic support on the Facebook thread.
Yeah, of course.
Thank
All right,
you.
adios.
Thank you.
All right, peace. Thanks. Bye.